Welcome to Culture Anthropology. In this lecture we will talk about social organization. Two main topics will be subsistence strategies, which are the way people get their food, and also politics, which is the way people organize power within each other or between each other, and the way they get people to do things or follow rules, or the way that things are distributed throughout the society. The third topic will be economics, and that'll be a whole separate lecture that will be after this one. This lecture will be split into two parts. So the first half will be about subsistence strategies, and the second half will be about politics. The whole lecture itself will be split into what Elman Service, anthropologist from the 60s who studied Latin American cultures, called socio-political typologies. He came up with four main socio-political typologies. And these are the categories we still use today in anthropology to organize societies into different categories. And this is mainly based on how they get their food, really. They tend to line up with hunters and gatherers, horticulturists, agriculturists, and we'll go over all these topics. And by the end, you should know what a band is, what a tribe is, what a chiefdom is, what a state is, and you should be able to apply these concepts to the readings in class. So in 1962, Elman Service put out his, probably one of his best-known works called Primitive Social Organization. This book was based on his ethnographic research and the research of others. And in this book, he came up with his socio-political typology that we still use to categorize societies in anthropology. The four main groups that Service suggested were bands, tribes, chiefdoms, and states. A band is a group of people, usually less than 100 or so, that are bound together through kinship. They're usually a clan, like what we talked about when we talked about kinship. They would have a common apical ancestor. Sometimes that would be a totem. This is an example here of a band that is in southwest Michigan, which is part of the Potawatomi tribe. So sometimes bands can be a smaller group of a larger tribe. A tribe is a group of people, a society that is bound together by kinship also. It's much larger usually. It's made up of multiple lineages, multiple kindreds. The Yanomama are an example of a tribe. They usually have shared politics, more collective politics, shared resources. One person doesn't own more than another person usually, or at least have access to more. They do have differing statuses in the society. It can be based on who you were born to, or it could also be based on things you've achieved throughout your life. This framework is actually what you would call a neo-evolutionary framework. It's not evolutionary in the sense of the social Darwinian idea that we're progressing toward something better, more civilized per se. But as things became more complex, as people started raising more food and became less sedentary, we moved into what were known as chiefdoms. A chiefdom is a social category where there's one leader who is usually very charismatic and is usually part of a lineage, sometimes divine lineage within these chiefdoms. The Vikings would be considered a chiefdom. The early Mississippian culture in the United States, which I guess you would call late Mississippian, prior to Western contact, they would have been a chiefdom. And as these become more complex, you begin having multiple people that run the society, multiple people that make decisions. And when this happens, you have what's called a state. A state is run by a bureaucracy So a group of people that make the decisions that either are voted in or could just take control of the state. And this is where we are. We are in a state. We have our bureaucracy that we have voted in. Central American city-states, they had a bureaucracy. They didn't vote on it. It was divinely ordained. City-states of Mesopotamia, divinely ordained. Egypt was also a state who had leaders, a group of bureaucracy. And many times, within the same geographical area, you may have nested social organization. So in Africa, there's many states in Africa. They were put in place following colonization and also after World War II. Within these states and even across borders in these states, there's chiefdoms, there's groups of people, there's cultures that organize themselves into chiefdoms and tribes. And they are existing within the state with their own politics. We also have this in the United States. We have many tribal organizations of Native Americans that still follow political patterns of tribal societies, and they are within our own nation, but they are not within our own states. They are not. They have their own politics and they have their own government. So this is an example of how anthropological categories are not set in stone. So as I mentioned before, Service was a neo-evolutionary social researcher. He studied how societies evolved, how they moved from one stage to another between these four stages. Usually this happened because of the way that either it happened because of the way that they were collecting food or the way that they fed themselves, or as a result of them moving into it, they began feeding themselves differently. There's two main types of subsistence strategies. The first is food collector, and the other is food producer. We can split all subsistence strategies into these two categories. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that some societies are only that there aren't societies that are both food collectors and food producers. However, these are the two types of strategies. The simplest type of food collector is called a small-scale forager. Small-scale foragers, such as the Kalahari Bushmen of Africa, they tend to move around in small groups. They tend to live in small communities. They move to where the food is, so they may move their encampments around multiple times a year. Their politics are more collective, so they tend to make decisions through more council-type decision-making, where everyone would come to a consensus. And their division of labor, you do things based usually on your gender. Now we have to remember this is gender and not sex. So, for example, some of the Native American societies, such as the Navajo, they did some hunting and gathering. They also were horticulturalists, which we'll get to in a little bit. And they also allowed for certain people that would be biologically male to also be female. And those biologically male females, which were called the Navi, would actually take on labor of females. So they would do things such as gathering, making baskets, weaving, taking care of the children. Okay, so within these societies, you did have clear-cut defined jobs, and those were based on which gender you were. The other type of food collector would be the complex foragers. The complex foragers, such as the Inuits in Alaska, are many times fishing communities. They tend to not be nomadic, and they usually have facilities where they can store food. Because of this, sometimes they are a little more hierarchical. They may have some people with higher status because and with higher access to resources because they may be the ones in control of the surplus. The first type of food producer we'll talk about are herders. So herders or pastoralists are people that have domesticated animals. They raise animals. They move in what are known as transhumance cycles. Transhumance cycles are simply the patterns that people move based on the needs of the cattle or the herd. So people may move to where there is more grazing, where there's better grazing during certain times of the year, and they will move the whole community to these areas. They'll just pick up and move into them, and then when the time comes to move again, they'll move into the other area where there's good grazing. This map shows places in the world where we still have nomadic pastoral tribes, where they are usually tribal. Sometimes they're moving their way into a chiefdom. So in Mongolia, Africa, and actually in northern Scandinavia, the Laplanders raise reindeer up there. And finally, we have what are known as the farmers, the agriculturalists. And we're going to talk about three main types of farmers here. The first type would be the horticulturalist. So a horticulturalist, they usually practice what's known as slash and burn or swidden agriculture. They're what we would call gardeners. They use a lot of land, so they're what is known as land extensive. They also use a lot of labor. They are usually nomadic, and they're usually tribal. So the Yanomama are a great example of nomadic tribes that practice horticulture. They live in their shabanos or their villages certain times of the year. They have a garden there, and then sometimes they will move to another one, and they will pick up their roots here. This is a picture of a Yanomamo gentleman picking up his sweet potato roots and moving them to a new garden where they would have burned the forest and then started a new garden. So once you exhaust the soil, you move to a new place, you burn down a new section of the forest, and you start a new garden. This was a great management system when there was a lot of space and there were less people. As other people are encroaching on the space of these indigenous peoples, it's becoming less of a viable option because they're running out of places to burn and then go back, years later to the other place that they had exhausted, which had grown over again, and then they burn again. Horticulturalists that practice this type of food production tend to be very creative in the way that they grow their crops. They use what are called intercropping systems. One of these intercropping systems is called la milpa.
And take it away to your colleague.
This is an example of it. So la milpa is a type of intercropping procedure that they use in Mesoamerica, Latin America a lot. Horticulturalists, traditionally with swidden agriculture, the slash and burn agriculture. This is the way that you can use as much as you can out of your space and out of your soil and get as much as you can for subsistence to live on. So of course this first starts with corn, which is the staple crop of Latin America. And they'll have these corn plants, and traditionally they would grow up the corn plants, bean plants. So then you have your corn and you have your protein with your beans. And then underneath this, you would grow squash. And the great thing about this type of intercropping is that weeds cannot come up through the ground because you have the ground covered with your squash. And at the same time, as the sun comes down, the sun never actually hits the ground, which also keeps weeds from coming up through the ground and also takes full advantage of the sunlight.
with this type of cropping pattern, people can also at times grow fruit trees up through it and do other creative things and use as much of the land as possible to get as much of the food out of it as possible. So when we talk about industrial agriculture, we'll talk about how it's extensive and intensive. This, in a way, is intensive. It does use a lot of the land, but at the same time, it does not exhaust the land as much, because when the land is exhausted, they have other lands to go to where they can let this grow back through the rainforest or other forest, where they can let this grow back wild. The next step in farming is usually what is known as intensive agriculture. Intensive agriculture, you grow a lot of the same thing in one place. Chiefdoms began doing this as they needed more food. They would grow things like corn and beans, but only one crop in the field and a lot of it at once. And finally, we would move into intensive and extensive. So a lot of one thing on a lot of land. And this is what is called industrialized agriculture. It's using technology to get as much yield as you can with the least amount of inputs. The foundation of food production is domestication. So domestication is just simply manipulating evolution to meet the needs of a society or meet the needs of humans. With plants, there's only a couple thousand that have actually been domesticated out of the hundreds of thousands that could be domesticated. It's mainly because humans will find one type of grass per se that maybe has a really good, what they call a ratchet at the top of it that holds onto the seeds really well, that has really big seeds so that when you harvest it, you don't knock the seeds off. And they would take this and they would take those seeds off and they would begin planting those seeds, and then they would propagate the species. And once they picked a good one, they would go with it, such as corn or wheat or oats. With animals, there's really only about 100 species that have ever been domesticated. And there probably aren't many more that can be domesticated. So as opposed to being able to go out and hunt for multiple kinds of animals, you begin narrowing down the choices of things that you can eat. Here's some examples here that come out of some of Jared Diamond's work. You read an article by Jared Diamond prior to this lecture, or at least you should have. These are some comparisons of animals that have been domesticated and one plant, and others that are related that are still wild. So to domesticate an animal means that its offspring has to also be tame, or has to also be able to live with humans. So you can tame, say, a lion to live with people by raising it from the time it's small, but that lion's offspring will eat you, basically. So, like a zebra is another example. People have tamed zebras, but the offspring is always going to be wild. An example down in the corner with plants is the almond. So the wild almond is actually poisonous, and people have figured out how to domesticate over time. They selected. This is called selection. So they've selected for the ones that have less poison in them, or in the case of corn here, have the bigger kernels. And like I said with the grass before, they would select for that, and then they would plant it. And that's what happened with corn. These are three examples of some ancient corn. This is what corn would have looked like for the ancient Americans. Anthropologists have done what's called experimental archaeology to begin to uncover how people would have selected for different flora. So they would find things such as this sickle here in an archaeological dig. They would find remnants of one, and they would rebuild one based on the models of the artifacts that they found. Then they would go around the area that they found it in, and they would begin harvesting different wheats or different grasses or other things with that side. And for example, here that has obsidian, which is a sharp volcanic rock in a bone. And they would see how much that they could gather in a certain amount of time. In some places, such as the Fertile Crescent, which we're going to talk about, they actually would be able to harvest enough in like 2 weeks with one of these to be able to feed a family for the rest of the year. So this kind of shows how humans began utilizing what was in the natural world and morphing it to their own advantage. So they didn't have to move around as much to try to find their food. Agriculture, of what we think of as agriculture now, food production, first started in what's known as the Fertile Crescent. There's a little debate as to whether maybe it started in Asia also, because they found some sites in China that may be pretty close to the same age. And whether it's in China or the Fertile Crescent, this happened about 12,000 years ago. This would be towards the end of the Neolithic period, it's called. The end of the Stone Age, the new Stone Age. About 3,000 years later, Mexico began, people in Mesoamerica began farming also. And then about 4,000 years after that, people in Africa and the Andes also started farming. So this all kind of happened around the same time. This map here shows in the red where agriculture started, and the yellow shows the most productive places in the world now with agriculture. So it shows how it's spread out. Really the only overlaps are in China and in the eastern United States, which is kind of interesting. So the Fertile Crescent is in what's known as the Levant, which we've talked about before when we talked about religion, right in here. And the Fertile Crescent is more or less this area right here, and this is where agriculture started. One of the first cultures, and some people think that maybe the first farming culture is known as the Natufian culture. The Natufian culture was about 12,000 BC to around 9,000 BC. These people had storage facilities. They are the earliest culture where we find storage facilities for grains. They also ceremoniously buried their dead, and some graves show more artifacts within the grave that may indicate that there was a hierarchical society amongst the Natufian. This is an interesting video of work that's being done in the Levant area to research who the Natufian were.
The Natufian culture was a group of people that lived in this part of the world, today's Israel, Lebanon, Syria, the Levant, around 15,000 to 11,000 years ago. Now, these people were not agriculturalists, they were hunter-gatherers, but they were systematic collectors. They were hunting and gathering on a massive, diversified scale. And that diversification, the different kinds of foods that they were collecting in their natural environment, their beginnings of a systematic collection of grains and creation of compound little sickle tools to harvest grains, and systematic collection not only of large mammals, the gazelles and aurochsen and other kinds of large mammals that live in this area, but also small mammals and fish with dedicated fishing villages. That kind of diversification has been called the broad spectrum revolution. When we think about how agriculture emerged, that emergence was not initially because of the actions of a really smart inventor who figured out that if we plant seeds in a certain way, they will grow and we can harvest them and collect a share of them and keep some to plant the next year. No, this is a process that emerged over thousands of years as people began to use resources more systematically in particular places. Natufian people were among the first in the world to be sedentary hunter-gatherers. They lived in permanent or semi-permanent settlements. They built structures that were simple by the standards of later peoples in this area, but still had huts that were made of branches and leaves and with circles of stones forming their foundations. They buried people in contexts immediately in or around their villages. They were coming back to these places and using them for long periods of time. And they were investing resources, labor, work, social ties into these places. Because they were using these places so intensively, they began to use the resources around these places more intensively. They were increasing, if you like, the efficiency of extraction of foods and other resources from these places. They were trading over longer distances. They were developing denser, more stable populations. And we now recognize that all of those changes were really precursors to the invention of agriculture, where you're staying in a place long enough to store foods there, to replant seeds the next year, and to stay there or return there to harvest them in the following year. That kind of cycle of life really necessitates that you have already adapted to a more sedentary lifestyle. The Natufian people in this area were some of the first peoples anywhere in the world to make that transition. El Wad is the site of a Natufian village. And the people were using the cave, which is a very deep cave. It goes way back into the into the hillside. But they were living outside of the cave on terraces. And those terraces, they were investing work in. They began to build walls to retain the soils on the terraces. They began to build little structures on the terraces. They began to bury their dead on the terraces.
When we talk about the Natufian, what we're talking about is the shift from small groups and nomadic hunters and gatherers to fully sedentary occupation, right? One of the reasons we can say that is you've got these permanent installations. You don't invest that much time and effort if in 2 weeks you're going to be leaving again, right? You can see here this terrace wall, right? Also, investment in time and energy, permanency. The number of burials that we have here. Again, I mentioned that we have 115, 120 individuals now, minimum number of. And we have evidence from microfauna, for example, commensals, which we don't see in smaller, more nomadic-oriented sites.
Oh, so you've got like rats that are living.
Rats, house mouse, sparrow, right? Beautiful, and they're well documented. We've got one MA and a dissertation come out of this from our department. So it's
they don't live away from human habitation now.
Right. The humans create this magnificent habitation for these kinds of animals. So, and you see them in other kinds of sites, but not in the kinds of densities that you see here.
They're living out here. They're using the cave for something, but they're living out here. They've got houses out here.
Bonus. You can live, be a Natufian without a cave. Because there are villages in Enam and other places without a cave. The cave is nice.
Another thing that's changing in Natufian times is politics. If you're going to have large sedentary populations, you have to negotiate the use of space. You're going to encounter more different kinds of people doing more different kinds of things around you, and you're going to have ways of regulating those people so that the society's able to subsist. We see in Natufian times many pieces of evidence about the development of these political systems.
But we have a copy of one of the individuals that was found from here. That wasn't the exact spot. You notice that on the skull there's something stuck to this is a dentalium shell headdress. Dentalium shells and other materials were used as decorative elements in the jewelry. One thing that's very, very interesting is that there are individuals, male, female, sometimes youngsters even, that have this kind of decoration, others that do not. So we're thinking, you know, your treatment in death somehow reflects your standing in life.
Right.
But we may be seeing also as a shift from kind of egalitarian hunter-gatherers to some kind of hierarchical social organization.
We make a big deal when we see, you know, a little bit of ornamentation in Neanderthals. Here, it's systematic. I mean, this is helping to organize their society.
Right.
Yeah.
We're still trying to work out, you know, just who may have gotten it, who may not have gotten it, and this kind of thing. And you find dentalium shells scattered out through the excavations also, just lonely pieces, you know, whatever. And it's mostly in the early Natufian that we see this. Very, very little of this kind of decoration that you see in the late Natufian.
So did they just give it up, or just different social?
There seems to be, the hypothesis right now is that for whatever reason, we're not sure why, there's a bit of a dispersal again. And a shift from a little bit more mobility. They lose some of the sedentism. Some people related this to the younger dryas, poor environmental conditions. That doesn't really fit now what we have from the dates, whatever. So it's a question that we're trying to deal with. What happened between following the early Natufian going into the late, but as we're getting into our late Natufian here, we're finding that it wasn't such a kind of flimsy sort of settlement either. So again, there are a number of questions that we're trying to deal with.
Sure, yeah. So the Natufian people really give us the best evidence we have about what lifestyles were like among the last sedentary hunter-gatherers in this part of the world. And archaeologists and anthropologists now understand that as we go to study how agriculture emerged, the social structures, the use of time and place, the yearly cycle, all of these things are things that hunter-gatherers were understanding for thousands of years before we begin to see the development of domestication of plants and animals that enabled agriculture to begin in earnest. Agriculture, as a change in the subsistence pattern, is fundamentally economic. It's about the relationship of humans to each other and to their environments. But the social changes that enabled it are changes that happened without domesticated plants and animals. They were changes that represent innovations in human social systems. Those social systems are what began to change not only here in the Near East, but elsewhere in the world as agriculture was emerging.
So following the origins of agriculture, it began spreading fairly quickly. By 1000 BC, it was all over the world. And anthropologists have been able to track this through using written word, because after agriculture, the written words had to come along. They're finding remnants of seeds in archaeological digs, usually from the waste of humans. And other scientific methods such as electromagnetic spectrography and radio and carbon-14 dating, and they're able to track where agriculture went as people moved around the world and as this idea diffused between cultures.
Yet for all its advantages, the Fertile Crescent is not the powerhouse of the modern world, nor is it the breadbasket it once was. How did it lose its head start? Within 1,000 years of their emergence, most of the new villages of the Fertile Crescent were abandoned. Ironically, the region had a fundamental weakness. Despite having some of the most nutritious crops on the planet, its climate was too dry and its ecology too fragile to support continuous intensive farming.
people were destroying the environment. The waters had been overexploited, the trees had been cut, and this is what, when you face a dead end, I mean, you are facing a wall. You will end with landscape like that. I mean, with few trees, with no grass, and with less water. So what we are looking at today is the outcome of overexploiting the environment.
Unable to farm their land, entire communities were forced to move on. The advantages they'd accrued from centuries of domestication might have been lost. But again, geography was on their side.
The Fertile Crescent is in the middle of a huge landmass, Eurasia. There were plenty of places for farming to spread, and crucially, many of those places were to the east and west of the Fertile Crescent at roughly the same line of latitude. Why is that so important? Because any 2 points of the globe that share the same latitude automatically share the same length of day, and they often share a similar climate and vegetation. Crops or animals domesticated in the Fertile Crescent were able to prosper at other places along the east-west axis of Eurasia. Wheat and barley, sheep and goats, cows and pigs all spread from the Fertile Crescent, east towards India and west towards North Africa and Europe. Wherever they went, they transformed human societies.
Once the crops and animals of the Fertile Crescent reached Egypt, they caused an explosion of civilization. Suddenly, there was enough food to feed the pharaohs and generals, the engineers and scribes, and the armies of people required to build the pyramids. The same is true of European civilization. From ancient times until the Renaissance, the crops and animals of the Fertile Crescent fed the artists, inventors, and soldiers of Europe. In the 16th century, the same crops and animals were taken by Europeans to the New World. At the time, there was not a single cow or ear of wheat in all the Americas. Now there are 100 million cattle in the U.S. alone. And Americans consume 20 million tons of wheat a year. Modern, industrialized America would be unthinkable without the spread of farming from the Fertile Crescent.
So the culmination of food production really would be the industrialization of agriculture, which is what we have now. Like I mentioned before, basically industrialization of agriculture is trying to use get as much as you can out of as little as possible. Because of the industrialization of agriculture, less people are employed in making food. So we have less people making the food for us. Around the world, according to the CIA, only 30% of the world is producing food anymore. And in our society, in the United States, only 5% of the people are farmers. As you can see from this graph here, industrial agriculture has greatly accelerated the domestication of plants and also animals. Prior to 1950, you could only get about 20 bushels an acre. And from 1950 to 2000, that went well over 100, and now we're pushing over 200 bushels an acre. This has been made possible through hybridization, which is another way to accelerate selection. So through hybridization, which is taking two different types of plants and breeding them together for a sterile hybrid, you end up with a much larger final yield. So the ears are much bigger on this corn that is sterile, and this seed that is sterile. And anyone that has grown up in a rural area would be familiar with detasseling corn, because they go through and they detassel the corn, so only certain species will pollinate with other certain species. And when you have this cross-pollination, you get the benefits of both species. And this is one way that selection has been accelerated. The other way, which is a hot topic nowadays, is genetic modification. Through genetic modification, scientists have been able to inject certain strands of DNA from one species and put them into another species. Now, how this can be beneficial is when you have a certain species that is poisonous, for say, and for the example here, for the European corn borer, this Bt, which comes out of a bacteria, is put into the DNA sequence of corn. And when it's put into the DNA sequence of this corn, the new species that's created, the corn bearer, if it ingests any of the plant, it will die. There's other things they've done where corn doesn't need to be watered as much, or where you don't have to go through and till the soil as much. So there have been some benefits to genetic modification. And the jury's still out of what the future will be with genetic modification. We don't know exactly what will happen with the environment when you start putting these modified creatures in, because, as you know, prior to this we had hybridization. We were doing similar, but nothing at the level of what we're doing now. And also in some other countries there are issues with who owns this technology, because you begin owning biology. So as we've moved further from hunters and gatherers to our culmination of farming, where we're at right now, where we've fixed a lot of things, we may have opened a lot of new doors of more problems. And so now we're going to go back and we're going to kind of compare, now that I've talked about agriculture for a little bit, we're going to compare agriculture to foraging. With foraging, you have wild flora and fauna abundant. You have relatively less labor. So the labor, although it's split between genders, it's shared throughout the whole community. And you usually do not stay in one spot. Now, agriculture, on the other hand, domesticated plants and animals are very selective. Like I talked about earlier, there's only like 100 animals that have been domesticated, and not all of those are agricultural animals. And at the same time, your choice of plants are also very narrow. The labor is super intensive in agriculture compared to foraging. Now, not as many people may be doing the labor, but if anyone knows a farmer or is a farmer, you would not want to figure out how much you make an hour, let's say. And of course, it's usually sedentary. Now, I want to say here that, like I've said before, there's not necessarily, you can't, in some cultures, you can't really draw a line between foraging and agriculture. A lot of foraging society, a lot of hunters and gatherers have gardens, okay, and a lot of agriculturalists hunt or gather. So this is not a clear-cut distinction per se. And we need to understand that it's not necessarily better to practice agriculture. The lives of people that are hunters and gatherers aren't, as Thomas Hobbes, the philosopher, 19th century philosopher, said, their lives are not nasty, brutish, and short, per se. This is the view of the progressivists. The progressivists believe that agriculture has been nothing but a benefit for society, and it has moved us into civilization. It has progressed us out of this nasty, brutish, and short life. And this is not necessarily the case. The anthropological research shows a different picture. So, for example, with paleopathology, which is the study of ancient disease, they have found that the transition into agriculture did not necessarily make people healthier. So in the New World, so in what we would call the southeastern coast of the United States right now, the people there tended to all be hunters and gatherers prior to European contact. Following European contact, they became farmers. And through archaeological research, paleopathological research, anthropologists have been able to look at bones of these people and find that following agriculture, they were morphologically much different. Their bodies were different. They became smaller in stature. They may possibly have died from more disease. They also had different shaped bones because they were doing different types of work. They were doing a more repetitive work instead of a more doing different things. Like when you're out hunting, you do different movements than when you're continually just hoeing a field. Also, researchers have found in some Mississippian cities, such as Cahokia, which we'll talk about, in the chiefdoms of Cahokia and other places like that, as they started intensive agriculture of one type of crop, they began to have more diseases, and also an interesting thing was their dentition changed, because as they were grinding this corn on these rocks, little pebbles would get into your meal, and while you're eating your cornmeal, you'd bust your teeth. So paleopathology is a branch of what is known as bioarchaeology. It's the combination of biology, studying the biology of ancient humans through archaeological digs. So they also take into account the things around them, the artifacts. This is a modern human femur, so modern by meaning a fully a Homo sapiens sapiens, an evolved human. If you cut into the trabecular bone, which is basically the ball that goes into the socket of your hip, you'll find these cavities in here. It's kind of airy, kind of, you would call it, I guess. And when you compare this part of the bone between hunters and gatherers and agriculturalists, you find some different things. The hunter and gatherer it had a much stronger ball that went into that socket, because the hunter and gatherer spent more time moving around trying to, collecting food. And an agriculturalist became more sedentary. And as you became more sedentary, your bones became more brittle. Now, this doesn't mean that people didn't work, but the work they were doing were repetitive work that basically caused strain in only certain parts of the body, and you would work out certain parts of the body, but the whole body itself, such as, for example, the hip, would not get used quite as much because you'd be sitting processing things a lot of time. Now, a lot of times you would go out and be cultivating and hoeing and harvesting, but a lot of your time was also sitting and just using your hands. Whereas hunters and gatherers, every day they'd go out and doing something, and that tended to keep their bones stronger. So this is just another example of how human morphology changed pretty drastically as humans moved from this hunting and gathering into agriculture. So ethnographic research has also shown that pre-agricultural societies may have been healthier than those early agricultural societies, and also have shown that the standard of living may actually be higher than we had previously thought amongst hunters and gatherers. In '64, Richard Borsche Lee, he went and studied Bushmen in an area of Botswana. They were known as the Dobi. 14 camps he studied, and at that time those 14 camps didn't have much contact with the outside world. The people of the area subsisted on what they could forage on lands that were within a day's walk of their encampments, and he used quantitative analysis to compare multiple variables such as the amount of work used to collect the food, the nutritional value of foods, and the ratio of labor to leisure time. What Lee found was kind of surprising from the progressivist views of the time. The Dobi area was extremely abundant and did not necessitate long moves to places with food throughout the year. So they moved about 5 times a year. They were, your typical hunting and gathering nomadic people, but they never had to move more than 10 miles. And of the available fauna and flora, about a quarter was used for 90% of the foods. They didn't even have to use everything that the environment had for them. Half their diet was the mongongo nut alone, and many of these nuts just rotted out on the ground every year. So there was definitely an abundance of food around them. Only about 40% of each camp, so 40% of the people actually contributed to food procurement. So what the other people did is the younger people took care of the older people, and there were a lot of older people, so this indicated long and healthy lives. The most surprising thing that came out of Borsche-Lee's studies was that the amount of work compared to leisure. So the Dobe ended up working like 12 to 19 hours a week. Now, although most of this time was getting food did not take a lot of their time. Most of their time was actually just spent making things for fun and socializing or participating in religious dances. This work was corroborated by many other researchers following this seminal piece. And however, currently it's hard to do this kind of work because not many of these societies are in existence. They've been incorporated into the market economy, the global economy. And even the Dobe now, they're raising cattle, and their foraging way of life is being threatened by the sale of their food areas to wealthy ranchers. So those 6-mile radius areas that each of these encampments use are now being bought up, and they're raising cattle on them, and not necessarily cattle that they own. So finally, to wrap up this first section of social organization, the subsistence strategies, we're going to tie it into politics now, which will be the next section of this lecture. So as societies begin to have more surplus, as they move from a hunting and gathering society into an agricultural society, they end up with surplus. And when this happens, you end up with more social stratification. So by social stratification, I mean how society. And as you move from band, tribe, chieftain to state, this social stratification usually becomes much more pronounced. The status people have in societies, and as we move from band, tribe, chieftain to state, how that status changes and how the societies become more hierarchical or stratified.